The Nile always smelled of life. Kemet remembered the mornings when the sun rose over the riverbanks, spilling gold across the water. His wife Nari would hum softly as she ground grain, their infant son crying softly in her arms. The air carried the scent of wet clay and bread baking in clay ovens. For a time, that was his world, simple, free, sacred. But freedom ended the day the pharaoh's men came. They came not with mercy, but with fire. First came the thundering of hooves, the dust rising like a storm. Villagers scattered, women pulling children into huts, men grabbing whatever tools they could to fight. But what was a farming sickle against bronze-tipped spears? Kemet had been hauling water when the first screams pierced the air. He dropped his pot and ran, his bare feet slapping the mud as he sprinted toward the huts. He saw soldiers dragging women by their hair, striking down old men who dared to resist. The air filled with smoke from burning thatch and the desperate wails of mothers. He found Nari clutching their son, her body pressed against the reed walls of their home. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Kemet," she whispered, "run!" But there was no escape. The raider struck him down, the flat of a spear cracking across his face. His vision blurred as his wife screamed his name. His last memory before darkness was the sound of his son crying sharp, thin, helpless, carried away on the wind. He woke in chains. The air stank of sweat, blood, and fear. He was bound to a line of men, their ankles chained, their wrists tied. The soldiers herded them forward like cattle. Sun scorched their backs as they trudged across the desert, the sand burning their feet raw. Any man who stumbled was lashed. Until he staggered forward again, Kemet's body ached, but his heart hurt worse. He called out for Nari, for his son, but no one answered. Around him, other captives hung their heads, silent in their grief. Some muttered prayers, others whispered names, fragments of families left behind. Days blurred together. The desert stretched endlessly, mocking them with mirages of water. Their only drink came from filthy skins passed down the line. Never enough. At night they collapsed in the sand, only to be dragged up again at dawn. The soldiers laughed as they walked, their bronze armor gleaming under the sun, while the chained men limped in the dust like shadows. Finally, after endless days, the horizon shifted. It rose like a mountain carved by hands, a pyramid, its sides steep and unfinished, stone blocks piled high. Around it sprawled a city of tents, fires, and scaffolding. The air rang with the cries of men straining under heavy loads, the crack of whips, and the shouts of overseers. This was to be their prison. The captives were lined up before a man in white linen robes. His skin was darkened by sun, but his eyes gleamed with cruelty. This was the overseer, the pharaoh's hand at the pyramid site. He walked slowly before them, inspecting like a man choosing animals at a market. "You belong to Pharaoh now," he declared, his voice sharp as stone. "Your bodies are his tools, your blood his mortars. Do not falter, do not disobey, or you will die where you stand." His words were followed by the crack of a whip. The lash tore into the back of a young man who had lifted his head too high. The scream that followed froze Kemet's blood. The overseer smiled. "Good, you understand." From that day, Kemet's life was measured in lashes and stones. The first day of labor broke him in ways he did not know a body could break. The slaves were herded to the quarry, forced to haul massive blocks of limestone. The sun seared the flesh from their backs, the ropes cut into their shoulders. Every step felt like drowning in sand. Kemet's hands blistered and bled, his back slick with sweat. When he faltered, a whip cracked against his skin, tearing it open. The pain was so sharp it stole his breath. The overseer leaned close, his lips curling in a sneer. "Work, beast. Work or die." Kemet wanted to shout his name, to tell them he was a man, not an animal. But his mouth was too dry, his voice too weak. He lowered his head and kept pulling. That night he lay on the ground with the others, the stars above cold and distant. His body throbbed with pain, but his mind was louder. He saw Nari's face, heard his son's cries. He pressed his forehead into the sand and wept silently, afraid to let the overseers hear. Freedom was gone. Family was gone. All that remained was stone, whip, and blood. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small flame flickered. It whispered, "Remember, endure, do not forget who you are." The morning horn tore through the silence. Kemet jolted awake, his body stiff, his mouth caked with dust. Around him, men groaned as they were kicked awake by guards. The sun had barely risen, yet the heat already clung to their skin. "Up, slaves!" shouted a guard, his voice cutting across the camp. Pharaoh does not wait for dogs. The crack of whips followed, lashing into bare backs. Kemet staggered to his knees, his body screaming in protest. His shoulders still burned from the day before, the rope scars raw and oozing. He tasted blood when he coughed, as the line of slaves formed. Kemet glanced at the man beside him, an older figure with hollow eyes, his beard streaked with gray. The man noticed Kemet staring and muttered, "Don't look too long. The guards don't like faces, only backs." Kemet swallowed, lowering his gaze. His lips trembled, but he whispered, "What is your name?" The man hesitated, then shook. "His head names are for free men. Out here, we are beasts." Kemet's heart clenched. "No, I will not forget mine," he whispered softly to himself, as though repeating a prayer. "Kemet, my name is Kemet." The man gave a small, bitter smile, as if pitying him. "Then may the gods help you hold on to it." They were marched in a single file, chains clinking like the rhythm of death. Dust rose with every step, burning their throats. Ahead, the unfinished pyramid loomed larger with each pace, its shadow stretching like a giant's hand across the desert. The overseers barked orders, their staffs raised high, their whips trailing lazily like serpents waiting to strike. Each man carried tools, ropes, or dragged carts that groaned under the weight of stone. When they reached the worksite, the overseer in white linen, the one who had spoken the night before, raised his arms. His voice rang clear. "You belong. To Pharaoh, every stone you raise is eternal. Pharaoh's name will live forever because you will break yourselves for it. Your sweat, your blood, this is your offering to him." His words were followed by silence, broken only when he snapped his fingers. Instantly, guards drove the slaves forward. Kemet's first task was to haul water skins from the Nile to the worksite. The skins were massive, heavy enough to bow his shoulders. Each trip cut into his strength, his muscles quivering as he stumbled across the sand. Guards jeered as he staggered, calling him donkey dog, beast. By midday, his vision blurred, his feet dragged, his knees buckled, and the water sloshed onto the ground. That was his mistake. A whip cracked across his back before he could recover. He fell forward, the weight of the water skin crushing his chest. The guard standing over him sneered, "Get up, animal, or do you want the vultures to eat you now?" Kemet tried to rise, but his arms shook. The whip lashed him again. He gasped, pain searing through his body. His lips trembled, but he forced the words through clenched teeth. "My name is Kemet." The guard froze for a moment, then laughed cruelly. "Your name is nothing. You are nothing." He kicked Kemet hard in the ribs. "Say it again, and I'll cut your tongue out." Kemet pressed his face into the sand, biting back a scream. He wanted to fight, to strike, but his body betrayed him. He dragged himself up, lifted the water skin again, and walked. That night, the slaves were thrown scraps of bread, moldy, dry, calling with ants. The guards tossed it onto the dirt, forcing the men to scramble like starving dogs. Kemet stared at the bread, his stomach twisting with hunger, yet his hand trembled. As he picked up a piece from the ground, every bite tasted of humiliation. Around him, men devoured theirs in silence, their eyes hollow, their backs hunched. The older man from earlier sat near him, chewing slowly. He leaned close and whispered, "You'll learn. Don't fight the whip. Don't speak your name. The pyramid will take everything, and no one will remember us." Kemet turned his gaze upward. Above them, the stars glittered cold and distant, as if mocking their pain. His body was broken, his pride shattered, but still, something inside him whispered, "Remember, endure." And so. Beneath the desert sky, Kemet swore silently that no matter how deep the lash cut, he would not let them erase him. His name was Kemet, and he would not forget asterisk. The next days blurred into agony. Kemet's hands split open as he hauled ropes tied to massive blocks. Every stone was like dragging a mountain. His back became a map of lashes, dark raw stripes crossing one another. At night, he could not lie on his back without biting his lip to stop from crying out. He began to notice the rhythm of the overseers. The way their whips cracked, not only to punish but to remind the men of their place. He watched a young slave stumble, too weak to continue. The boy fell to his knees, whispering for water. The overseer struck him again and again until he stopped moving. His body was dragged away and dumped outside camp where the jackals waited. Night, no one spoke of the boy. No one dared. But Kemet felt the silence cut deeper than any lash. On the 5th night, as he lay staring at the stars, he heard a voice, soft, broken, but human. Here, it whispered, he turned and saw a piece of bread held out by a thin hand. It belonged to a young woman, her face shadowed but her eyes sharp and alive. "You dropped yours earlier," she murmured. Kemet hesitated. No one gave food here, yet something in her gaze, defiant, almost angry at the world, made him. "Take it. My name," he whispered hoarsely, "is Kemet." For a moment, her eyes softened. "Zara," she said, and then she turned away before the guards noticed. It was only a fragment of humanity, a stolen breath in a sea of suffering. But to Kemet, it was enough. The next morning, when the horn tore through the camp and the whips cracked in the air, he whispered his name again beneath his breath. "Kemet, I am Kemet. I will not forget." And so began his life as a builder of Pharaoh's dream, a slave in chains, torn from the river of his past, thrown into the desert of his torment. The horn split the darkness before dawn. Kemet opened his eyes to the sting of sand and the weight of exhaustion. He had not slept. His body ached too deeply, his lashes too raw. Men groaned around him as guards stormed into the camp. Whips cracked, tearing into backs, still curled in sleep. Up, Pharaoh does not wait. For dogs. The words cut sharper than the lashes. Chains rattled as slaves staggered into lines. The smell of sweat, rot, and blood hung thick in the air. Kemet's stomach churned with hunger, the scrap of bread from last night already gone, swallowed by a body that never felt full. The overseer in white linen robes stood on a wooden platform, his arms folded. His face was calm, almost bored, as if he were watching ants instead of men. "Today," he announced, "you prove your worth. Pharaoh's stones do not move themselves." The command was followed by the cracking of whips. Kemet was tied to a hauling rope with 6 others, their shoulders pressed into the thick fibers. Before them lay a limestone block, massive, unyielding. The sight of it alone broke the spirit. "Pull," the overseer barked. The men leaned forward as one there, muscles straining. The rope cut into Kemet's skin, reopening old wounds. Sand slid beneath their feet, fighting them with every step. The block groaned forward, a fraction dot. The overseer paced alongside, whip coiled in his hand like a serpent. Whenever the rope slackened, it lashed. One man stumbled, and the overseer struck him across the face, splitting his lip. Kemet gritted. His teeth, he forced his body forward, breath ragged, vision darkening at the edges. His shoulders burned, his back screamed. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Hours blurred. By midday, the stone had moved barely 10 paces. Beside Kemet, an older slave collapsed, coughing blood. His name was Amen. Kemet had heard him speak in whispers during the night. The man fell to his knees, the rope slipping from his hands. The overseer raised his whip. "Get up, old dog." The lash cracked down. But before it could fall again, Kemet shifted forward, taking the rope's weight onto his own shoulders. His knees trembled. The pain was unbearable, but he refused to let Amen fall. The whip struck anyway. It tore into Kemet's ribs, the pain exploding through his body. He bit down on his tongue to stop from screaming. Amen, trembling, dragged himself up again. He looked at Kemet with hollow eyes and whispered, "Fool, but thank you." That night, the camp was silent. The guards threw scraps of bread into the dirt, laughing as starving men clawed at them like dogs. Kemet crouched, lifting a piece from the sand, brushing away the grit. He glanced at Amen, who sat apart, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Without a word, Kemet broke his bread in 2 and offered half Amen, stared at it, then shook his head weakly. "Keep it. You'll die if you don't eat," Kemet muttered. The old man gave a broken laugh. "We'll all die. Some sooner, some later." He took the bread at last, chewing slowly, as if swallowing ash. Kemet looked up at the stars, cold and merciless. His back burned, his stomach ached, But his mind whispered the same prayer it whispered each night. Remember, endure. Zara passed nearby, carrying a water skin for the guards. Their eyes met briefly. For a heartbeat, Kemet saw something in her gaze. Pity, anger, maybe even defiance. Then she looked away. The overseers had noticed him today. His small act of defiance had not gone unseen. To them, he was a spark, and sparks were dangerous. At dawn, when the horns sounded again, the first whip cracked across his back. Not for failing, not for stumbling, but because he had carried another man's weight, and that was enough. The days grew heavier. Kemet's hands became raw stumps, blistered and bleeding. The ropes cut deeper into his shoulders until his skin peeled. Each morning began with lashes, not words. Each night ended with the groans of men who would not live to see another sunrise. The overseers delighted in their cruelty. They mocked the slaves as they bled, calling them beasts, pigs, animals. They forced them to sing praises to Pharaoh as they worked, their voices hoarse, their throats cracked with thirst. One morning, Zara was dragged before the line of men. The overseer sneered as he shoved her to her knees. This one thought herself above orders, he said. She refused to command. He struck her across the face. The sound echoed like a stone splitting. She fell, her cheek bleeding, her eyes burning with humiliation. The men watched, their faces expressionless, afraid to show pity. Kemet's fists clenched, his heart thundered. He wanted to leap forward to shield her, but he knew what would happen. Instead, he whispered under his breath, "Zara." Her head lifted just slightly, as if she had heard. That day, Kemet worked harder than he ever had. Every stone felt like vengeance, every step like defiance. Yet his strength faltered. Near sunset, his knees buckled under the weight of a block. The overseer was on him instantly. The whip tore across his back once, twice, 3 times. Blood ran freely, dripping into the sand. "Look at me," the overseer barked. Kemet raised his head, his eyes blazing even through pain. "I am Kemet," he rasped. The whip fell again, harder. The overseer smiled cruelly. Not for long. That night, Kemet could barely move. His back was torn open, his body trembling with fever. But as he lay on the ground, he repeated his name over and over, whispering it like a shield. Kemet, Kemet Ki. Met as long as he remembered, he was still a man. Asterisk. The desert sun showed no mercy. It was not yet midday, but the heat pressed down with such weight that even the strongest men sagged under its grip. Kemet felt it in his bones, a heaviness that made every breath ragged, every step harder than the last. His tongue was dry, a strip of leather against the roof of his mouth. When he swallowed, it burned. The line of slaves stretched endlessly, each man tethered to ropes, each body bent beneath the impossible labor of dragging stone across sand. The blocks groaned and shrieked against wooden sledges, leaving trails carved deep into the desert floor. Dust rose, clinging to their sweat-slick skin, choking them until every cough tasted of grit and iron. Food had been scarce for days. Instead of bread, the guards had thrown them little more than moldy scraps, not enough to sustain a child. Water came in thin rations, 1 sip at dawn, 1 at dusk. The cruel game was deliberate, to starve them, weaken them, and yet demand more from them. The weaker they grew, the more they had to be beaten forward. Kemet's stomach twisted painfully, hollow as the tomb he knew would one day claim him. He had once been strong, a man whose arms could carry his son high into the air, whose chest had been broad and proud. Now he was little more than bones wrapped in torn flesh, the whip's signature carved into him like hieroglyphs. Beside him, Aemon stumbled again. The old man's ribs were sharp against his skin, his eyes sunken. He pulled at the rope with trembling hands, each movement more labored than the last dot. The overseer, a lean man with cruel eyes, noticed. He rode past on a donkey, whip coiled loosely. In his grip, "Pull, old dog. Pull, or I'll flay the meat off your bones." Aemon gasped, trying to obey. His legs buckled. The block slowed. The overseer's whip cracked. Blood burst across Aemon's back. He collapsed face first into the sand, unmoving. The rope went slack, and Kemet felt the sudden weight drag at his shoulders. His teeth clenched. He knew what would come next. "You there," the overseer barked, pointing the whip at Kemet. "Take this weight, drag the stone, or join him in the pit." Kemet's muscles screamed in protest, but he bent low and heaved. The rope cut deeper into his flesh, tearing at scabs not yet healed. The block shifted inch by inch around him. The other slaves watched silently, their eyes hollow. None dared move, none dared help. To show compassion was to invite the lash when the overseer was satisfied. He barked an order, and 2 guards dragged Amon's limp body to the side of the road. He was still breathing faintly, but his eyes rolled back, his chest rattling with every shallow breath. "Leave him," the overseer said. "If the desert wants him, let it have him." Kemet's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to cry out, to demand water, mercy, anything, but he knew better. He pulled, and the stone crept forward again. By nightfall, the camp was filled, with silence broken only by coughing and the moans of the dying. Fires burned at the edges, not for warmth but for light, where overseers drank and feasted on food stolen from the backs of the men who labored. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the air, torturing empty stomachs until they cramped in agony. Kemet sat in the dirt, his back against the wooden post of the pen, his body broken. Across the yard, Amon lay where they had dumped him. Shivering in the cold desert wind, Zara moved between the slaves and the guards, carrying jugs of water. She was careful, her steps small, her eyes lowered. But as she passed near Kemet, she slowed. Her hand slipped, spilling a trickle of water into the dirt, but her eyes flicked toward him. Then to the jug it was dangerous, reckless even, but Kemet understood. When she passed again, she let the jug hang low. For an instant, her hand brushed his, and the skin of the jug pressed against his palm. He lifted it quickly, sipping once, twice, the cool liquid shocking against his dry throat. He wanted to drain it, but he forced himself to stop, to hand it back. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. No words were spoken. None needed to be. That sip kept him alive. Later, when the guards had grown drunk and laughter rang out across the camp, Kemet crawled toward Amon. The old man was barely conscious, his lips cracked, his skin fevered. "Kemet," he whispered, the sound a rasp. "I'm here," Kemet answered softly. He cupped sand in his hands and carried it to his friend's mouth, but it was useless. Amon's hand lifted weakly, gripping Kemet's wrist. His nails dug into skin with surprising strength. "Listen to me. You must endure. You must live, carry their cruelty, but never let them take your name. You are Kemet. Remember it. Always." Tears burned Kemet's eyes. He wanted to promise, to swear it. But before he could speak, Amon's grip loosened. His hand fell, limp, into the sand. The old man's chest rose once. Then no more. Kemet sat there for a long time, staring at the lifeless body beside him. Around him, men lay in silence, pretending to sleep, for grief was dangerous. In his chest, rage coiled like fire. His body was too weak to fight, to beaten, to resist, but inside, his spirit screamed. They could starve him, they could beat him, they could burn his skin, chain his arms, break his bones, but he would remember and he would endure. The whip sang again at dawn. The sound carved through the silence like lightning splitting the sky, dragging every slave awake from restless, fevered dreams. Kemet rose slowly, his back stiff, his wounds raw against the rough fabric that barely covered him. The sand was still cold beneath his feet, but the overseers barked orders with no patience for weakness. "Up, dogs, on your feet," the men stirred, gaunt shadows rising into the pale desert light. Some were little more than bones, their skins sagging, their eyes hollow. Hunger had become more than an ache. It was a constant companion, gnawing at their insides, leaving them half-mad. Yet even madness was a luxury they could not afford. Kemet glanced at the place where Amon had lain. The sand was smooth now, disturbed only by wind. They had dragged the old man's body away in the night, dumped it into some pit with the others who had fallen. No prayers, no words, just silence. Kemet clenched his fists until his nails cut into his palms. He wanted to weep, but he had no tears left. The desert had taken even that from him. The day's labor was crueler than the last. The overseers had grown impatient. The pharaoh's stone tomb would not build itself. They ordered the slaves to move larger blocks, faster with less rest. Every mistake, every stumble, was met with a lash. Kemet's body screamed for mercy, but he gave none. He pulled, he lifted, he staggered forward with the others. His shoulders bled from the ropes, his back burned from the whip. At times, he thought he might collapse, but a single thought pushed him forward. I must endure by midday. A young boy collapsed beside him. He could not have been more than 14, his small frame ill-suited to the labor. He had been forced into the line only a week ago, and already his skin was torn, his lips cracked with thirst. The boy fell to his knees, gasping, unable to rise. The overseer noticed at once. He strode over, whip raised, eyes gleaming with cruel delight. "Up, rat," he snarled. "Up, or I'll carve your skin from your bones." The boy whimpered, trying to stand, but his legs failed him. The whip cracked. His cry tore through the air. Something inside Kemet broke. He lunged forward, catching the boy's arm, pulling him upright just before the overseer struck again. The overseer's eyes narrowed. He lifted the whip higher. "You dare?" Kemet bowed his head quickly, his chest heaving. "He will walk. He just needs a moment. Please." His voice was hoarse, raw yet steady. The whip hovered. The silence stretched out. Then the overseer smiled, a terrible smile. "Then you will walk for him." The lash came down across Kemet's shoulders, splitting his skin open. He bit down hard, forcing himself not to cry out. Another strike followed. Then another, each tearing through flesh. Each a punishment, not just for him, but for anyone who dared defy the order of things. At last, the overseer lowered his whip. "Now pull, dog, pull, or I'll make sure you never see another sunrise." Kemet bent forward, dragging the rope, his breath ragged, his body shaking. The boy stumbled beside him, trying to help, tears streaking his dirty face. Kemet said nothing. Pain was his answer. Endurance was his rebellion. That night, the boy crept close to him in the pen, whispering so softly it could barely be heard. "Why did you help me?" Kemet turned his head slowly. The boy's eyes were wide, frightened, but alive. He had not been beaten to death, and that alone was a victory. "Because once someone helped me," Kemet murmured, his voice low, broken. "And because you must live, you must carry the fire, even when it burns you." The boy stared at him, then nodded, clutching his knees to his chest. Kemet leaned his head back against the post, his gaze fixed on the stars above. For a moment, the chains around his soul felt lighter, but he knew it would not last tomorrow. The desert would demand more blood. The stones did not care who carried them. They did not care for the names of men, nor the pain in their bodies. The blocks were eternal, vast and unyielding, each weighing more than 100 lives combined. The slaves were nothing more than shadows. Straining beneath them, ants crawling across the sand to feed the hunger of a god, who would never know their names. Kemet pulled until his arms trembled and his chest burned like fire. The ropes carved deeper into his shoulders, reopening wounds that had never healed. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging, but he dared not stop to wipe it away. Around him, the desert shimmered in waves of heat, the horizon blurring, the air itself heavy as molten iron. The overseer's voice cut through the haze. "Faster! Pull, you swine, or I'll see your flesh nailed to the sun." The crack of the whip followed, striking the man just ahead of Kemet. The victim stumbled, but did not fall. Falling meant death. Falling meant the lash would not stop. Until the body no longer moved, the slaves moved in unison, broken bodies bound together by rope and fear. Every block had to reach the base of the pyramid, hauled across wooden rollers, dragged up ramps slick with sweat and blood. The work was endless. The stones above loomed higher each day, the pyramid rising like a mountain of cruelty, casting its shadow over the broken men who built it. As the sun reached its cruelest height, Kemet's vision began to blur. The world spun, and his knees buckled for a moment. He bit down hard on his lip, the taste of blood sharp on his tongue. He forced himself to stay upright, forcing one leg in front of the other, dragging the block another inch. But the weakness grew. His body screamed with every step. Beside him, the boy he had saved, little Haru, stumbled too. His thin arms shook as he pulled at the rope, his face contorted with effort. Kemet leaned sideways, pressing his shoulder against the rope harder, taking more of the weight. His back screamed in protest, but he refused to let the boy fall. The overseer noticed. His eyes narrowed, the corner of his mouth curling into a sneer. He strode over, whip dangling from his hand like a snake, ready to strike. "You again," he said, his voice cold, always carrying another's burden. "You think yourself noble? You think yourself strong?" Kemet kept his head down, dragging the rope, saying nothing. The whip cracked across his back. Tearing flesh, he staggered, but did not fall. Another strike followed, then another. Blood ran freely now, dripping down his sides, soaking into the rope. But still, he pulled. The overseer leaned close, his voice low, venomous. "One day, dog, I will break you so completely that you will beg me for death." Kemet did not answer. He kept walking, his silence the only defiance he had left. That night, the camp reeked of sweat, blood, and despair. The men collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to speak, too broken to even look at one another. The overseers drank by the fire, their laughter carrying across the night like jackals feasting on carrion. Kemet sat with his back against the post, his wounds burning. Haru sat beside him, small and trembling, his eyes wide in the firelight. "You shouldn't have taken my weight," the boy whispered. "They'll kill you," Kemet turned his head slowly. His voice was little more than a rasp. "Better me. Then you are young. You must survive." The boy's lip quivered. "But why? Why save me?" Kemet closed his eyes. For a moment he saw his son's face, round and bright, laughing in the sunlight of a life that no longer existed. His chest ached with memory. "Because once I had a boy too," he murmured, "and I could not save him. But I can save you." Haru's breath hitched. He leaned closer, pressing his small body against Kemet's side, seeking warmth. For the first time in months, Kemet allowed himself to rest his hand gently on another's shoulder. It was dangerous to feel, dangerous to hope, but in that moment, with the stars above and the desert stretching endless around them, he remembered that even in chains, the soul could still reach for something beyond pain. The desert wind carried secrets. At night, when the overseers grew drunk and careless around their fires, the slaves whispered. Their voices were low, barely more than breaths carried from one cracked mouth to another. But in those whispers lived something dangerous, more dangerous than hunger, more dangerous than the whip. Kemet first heard it when he was half asleep, his head heavy against the post, his wounds still damp with blood. Haru nudged his arm. "Listen," the boy murmured. At first, all Kemet heard was the groaning of men, too weak to move, the laughter of guards in the distance, the crackle of fire. But then, faintly, another sound threaded through the stillness. "They say, the river is close. If we break at night, too many will die. But perhaps some will live. Better to die running than die building another man's tomb." The words spread like sparks in dry grass. The men spoke of escape, of slipping into the darkness, of vanishing into the sands before the overseers noticed. Some said there was a village beyond the river that would hide them. Others said there were caves in the cliffs where the pharaoh's men would not search. None knew for certain, but still they whispered, because whispers were all they had left. Kemet's chest tightened. As he listened, his heart wanted to leap at the idea, to clutch it like water in the desert, but his mind was heavy with chains. He had seen too much, endured too much. "Hope is a lie," he muttered under his breath. Haru's eyes flashed in the dim light. "Then why are you still alive, if not for hope?" Kemet had no answer. The next day, the overseers worked them harder than ever. Rumors had reached their ears, perhaps, or maybe they simply sensed that the slaves' spirits were not as crushed as they should be. The lash fell more freely, food was scarcer, rest shorter. Kemet pulled until his muscles tore, his vision dimming. At times he thought he heard his wife's voice calling his name, soft and distant. At other times he saw Amon's face, lined with age whispering prayers that had gone unanswered. Still through the haze of exhaustion, he heard the whispers continue. The men had begun to look at him differently, not with the usual deadness, but with something searching. Some saw strength in him, others saw madness. That night, when the guards' laughter grew loud, one of the older slaves crawled close. His name was Beck. His body was bent, his back scarred so deeply it seemed, carved by knives, yet his eyes burned with quiet fire. "You are strong," Beck said softly, "stronger than most. If you lead us, some may live." Kemet shook his head. "I am no leader. I am just a man in chains. Beck's hand gripped his arm. That is why you must lead, because you know the weight of chains, because you endure when others fall. They will follow you, Kemet, whether you will it or not. Kemet stared at him, his jaw tight. He wanted to shout, to silence the whispers, to crush the fragile flame before it consumed them all. But Haru's eyes were on him, wide and pleading, and he felt the ghost of his own son's gaze in them. For the first time, Kemet did not turn away. The plan grew in fragments, carried mouth to mouth in the dark. They would wait for a night when the overseers drank too much, when the moon was hidden. They would slip their bindings, scatter into the sands, and pray the gods carried them farther than the whips. Each whisper was a gamble. Each glance could be betrayal. Yet the murmurs spread until even silence felt heavy with them. Kemet said little, but inside him something shifted. The stones he carried each day were no longer the heaviest weight upon him. It was the choice to stay, to live, to die. The desert listened and waited. The desert swallowed the night in silence. There was no moon, only the heavy cloak of darkness stretched across the sands. The overseers lay by their fire, drunk and sprawled, their laughter long faded into snores. For the first time in years, the camp was still. The whispers had grown teeth. Now they were no longer whispers, they were breaths caught in trembling chests, eyes darting toward the dunes, hands flexing against their bindings. Kemet sat with his back against the post, his body aching, his skin split and bruised. Haru leaned against his side, his small frame quivering with fear. Beck crouched close, his eyes gleaming with that same dangerous light that had burned in them for weeks. It must be tonight, Beck whispered. If we wait longer, the overseers will sense it. Too many will die before we even try. Kemet's chest tightened. His heart beat like a drum. Loud enough, he feared the guards might hear it. He turned his gaze to the massive shape on the horizon. The pyramid loomed against the starlit sky, its sides rising sharp and merciless. A mountain of stone that seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. He had bled for every block, every lash, every scream had gone into its walls. And yet it stood, untouched, eternal. He and the others would vanish into dust, their bones devoured by the sand, and the pyramid would remain, a grave for the nameless. Kemet swallowed hard. If we run, he murmured, many will die. Beck's jaw tightened. We are already dying. The words cut deeper than any lash dot. The signal was small, the quiet snap of rope, the shuffle of bare feet in the sand. One by one, the men loosened their bindings, each movement a prayer. Some wept silently as they pulled themselves free, too weak to believe they would live to see the morning. Kemet stood, his muscles trembling, his back screaming with every step. He pulled Haru up beside him, gripping the boy's hand tight. The child's eyes were wide, filled with terror and something more. Faith. They moved like shadows, dozens of them, slipping into the dunes, the campfire shrinking behind them. The desert stretched endless, vast, and merciless. Somewhere beyond lay the river, or villages, or freedom. Or nothing at all, but each step was theirs, not the pharaoh's, not the overseer's. Theirs it did not last. The first cry split the night, a guard jolting awake, shouting, stumbling toward the escaping shadows. Another joined him, then another, their voices rising like jackals baying. At prey, the crack of whips, the glint of spears caught in starlight. Run, Beck hissed, shoving men forward. Chaos erupted. The slaves scattered, their footsteps frantic in the sand. Some fell, too weak to move, and the overseer's weapons fell on them without hesitation. Screams tore through the night, sharp and raw. Before being swallowed by the desert, Kemet gripped Haru's hand and pulled with all the strength he had left. His lungs burned, his legs felt like fire, but he did not stop, not when the boy stumbled, not when the sound of death grew closer behind them. He had carried stones heavier than this. He could carry a child. The dunes rose before them, black waves rolling against the horizon. Kemet forced himself upward, dragging Haru with him, sand slipping beneath their feet. Every step felt like drowning. His vision blurred, stars swimming in his eyes. Behind them, Beck's voice roared a cry of defiance, cut short by steel. Others screamed, others fell. The desert drank their blood greedily, uncaring. Haru gasped, stumbling. I can't. Yes. You can, Kemet rasped, pulling him tighter. Run, boy! Run as if the gods themselves chase you. The boy's tears streaked his face, but he obeyed. At the crest of the dune, Kemet paused, his chest heaving. He looked back. The pyramid towered in the distance, black against the stars, vast and eternal. The overseer's torches flared at its base, spreading like fire through the camp, their shouts echoing across the desert. Bodies lay scattered behind, motionless. He knew most would not make it. Perhaps none, but he and Haru stood on the edge of something more than death. For the first time in years, Kemet was not beneath the shadow of the pyramid. He was above it, looking down, and in that moment, chains fell from his spirit, if not from his flesh. They ran until dawn bled across the horizon, painting the sands in fire. Haru collapsed at last, his small body trembling. Kemet dropped beside him, his own strength gone. His wounds throbbed, his body broken, but he smiled a faint, cracked smile. Haru looked at him through tears. Did we escape? Kemet's breath rattled. He looked toward the rising sun, toward the desert stretching endless before them. He did not know if freedom lay ahead. He did not know if death waited just beyond the dunes, but he placed his hand on the boy's chest, feeling the thrum of life beneath his palm. Yes, he whispered. We are free. His voice was steady, though his body was failing. His vision dimmed, his strength bled into the sand. But he clung to that final truth. The pyramid would stand for eternity. But so would this, a slave who had carried more than stones, who had borne another's life in his hands, and who had not broken when his eyes closed. It was not in despair. It was in peace. Asterisk.